I always like the story of the prophet Jonah. And perhaps what I'm going to say is a little self-accusatory, but I think in Jonah we get a great example of how most modern people would respond to a mission from God. We know from the book of Jonah that Jonah literally hears instruction from God, calling him to go to Nineveh, to people more powerful and more wealthy than him, and to call them out, to call them to account, to tell them where and why and how they're acting wrongly. And what's Jonah's immediate reaction? Hearing the literal voice of God, he goes, nope, and tries to run away. He's like, well, maybe he's the God of Israel alone. Maybe if I go to Egypt or somewhere else, he can't find me. Doesn't work out. Gets caught, gets thrown over the sea, over the boat into the sea, swallowed by a fish, where he repents. He admits, God, I messed up big time. Please forgive me. God's like, sure. You going to go to Nineveh? Yes, I'll go to Nineveh. Good. Spits him out right by Nineveh. As we heard today, Nineveh was a city that took 3 days to travel through. Jonah walks in preaching, and by the end of the first day, he's back outside the city watching and waiting for its destruction. So he maybe covered a quarter of it. He did what he said he would do, but he phoned it in, so to speak. But it was enough. It was the minimum. He did the minimum. But he did what God asked him to do. And it had an effect. It worked. The people realized their ways, repented, believed in the gospel, and turned back to God. And Jonah's reaction, likewise, I think, shows much of our modern mentality. Because he wasn't happy. He goes, but no. Why'd you forgive them? You should destroy them. God forgave you. Jonah's like, but I'm different. Many of us, I think, expect others to preach the gospel, to live the life of Christ. Just like many of us, I think, are all too happy to accept forgiveness for our own sin, our own wrongs, whether that comes from God or a fellow man. But likewise, I think many of us, myself included, at times can be very hard on others when they likewise ask for that same mercy and same forgiveness, which we have been shown so many times by God and our friends. Through our baptism and our faith in Christ, we are all called to the ministry as a prophet. We are all called to preach the gospel always, to be great fishers of men, to draw in the nets of the church all peoples, all nations, to mend those nets when needed, to offer correction, not only to those outside the faith, but even to those inside it. One of my favorite saints in the Middle Ages is Catherine of Siena, a woman who quite literally walked into the Pope's audience chamber in Avignon, France, poked him in the chest, and called him out for not being in Rome, and yet still professing to be the bishop of Rome. She took her prophetic nature to the height of the church. And the Pope, in his humility, acknowledged she was right. We are all called to preach, to spread the gospel. Sometimes we might do that like Jonah and do the bare minimum. Live a good life. Go to church. We might not be out in the streets proclaiming the good news. We might do the very minimum. But as we know with Jonah, the minimum is enough. Yes, some of us might be called to greater mission as priests, religious, clergy of some kind, as ministers, whether it's in music for the church, where even if you're compensated, I can assure you the compensation does not deal with the headaches that come from working for priests. Whether it's readers and lectors, Eucharistic ministers, sacrisans, servers. Many of us might take on deeper mission, and that is good. That should be commendable, and it is. But none of us can forget that we are all called to at least do the minimum, to preach the gospel with our very lives, to live a good and holy life, to show our faith to our children and our neighbors. Not necessarily with words. We don't necessarily need to go into the streets of Warren or Morristown and ring a bell and proclaim a fast. Sometimes we might. But for the most part, many of us can live out our prophetic call by living a holy life. St. Francis of Assisi is reputed to have said, "Preach the gospel always. When necessary, use your words." So I encourage you to do that. Even if you only do the minimum, preach the gospel always. And if necessary, use words.